Welcome to Bedtime's sleepy historian crescent moon. If you've just tucked yourself in, dimmed the lights, and are searching for a soft escape into the hidden corners of history, you're in the right place. Tonight's slow unfolding tale takes us not into the throne room, but above it. Into the misty dawns and quiet towers where falcons flew and secrets traveled on wings. Open book this is. The Lady Falconer who trained birds for royal gossip. A poetic, whisper-paced journey into the life of a medieval woman who spoke not with courtiers, but with birds. And through them, shaped the quiet politics of a royal court. If you're enjoying this gentle unraveling of the past, tap like, comment where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always cozy to know who else is awake, and of course, subscribe for more soft-spoken stories from history's forgotten shadows. Now take a deep breath. Let your shoulders fall. The falcons are circling, and they have much to tell. The whisper on the wing. In the gray hush before dawn, the castle's towers stood like sleeping giants beneath a sky still bruised with night. The only sound came from the rustle of feathers and the faint jingle of silver bells strung delicately from worn leather jesses. Lady Aelith crouched on the falconry ledge just outside the eastern turret, her cloak dusted with frost, her gloved hand raised toward the silent sky. The bird on her wrist was a pale-eyed saker falcon named Lyra, calm as still water, though her gaze cut like polished steel. They had been together for 9 winters. Lyra knew the rhythm of Aelith's breath and the secrets hidden beneath the hush of her voice. "Go, but listen first," Aelith whispered, pressing a scrap of folded parchment against the falcon's breast, tucking it beneath a wax-sealed clasp. "He'll be walking the orchard wall. You've watched him before." Lyra blinked once, a slow blink that looked like thought. Then she launched into the waking wind with a fierce snap of wings, scattering the frost into a fine white mist. From the courtyard below, no one noticed. Aelith stayed kneeling, feeling the emptiness on her wrist like a missing heartbeat. Her job, they thought, was to train birds for the hunt. But her birds carried more than claws. They carried confessions, flirtations, warnings dressed as riddles, and occasionally the odd insult cloaked in poetry. Royal gossip was a dangerous game, and in the castle's high places, secrets were currency more valuable than coin. And Aelith? She was richer than most would ever know. The tower beyond the kitchen smoke. There was a little tower, round and moss-stitched, behind the palace kitchens. It didn't look like much, just a squat finger of stone, half lost behind steam and the ever-blowing smoke from the bread ovens. Servants rarely glanced at it, and courtiers never wandered that far unless they were dreadfully lost or unbearably curious. But in the soft hush before dawn, when the world yawned and waited, something stirred above its narrow roof. Not smoke. Not birdsong. Not quite wind. Feathers. One by one, like shadows returning from a dream, falcons settled on the parapets. Their wings were dark and silent. Their claws clicked against worn stone. They did not screech. They waited. And below them, a woman moved. She was not young, not old. Her hair was always braided tight, with little white ribbons threaded through like winding rivers. She walked with a quiet kind of command, never hurried, never stilled. Her name was Eleanor, though few knew it. In the court, she was called Feather Mistress, or more often, nothing at all. She had once been a noble's daughter, then a falconer's apprentice, then something else entirely. Eleanor did not speak to people much these days, but she spoke to birds. And they, clever-eyed, razor-aloned, and watchful, returned to her with things no messenger dared carry. They brought her bits of parchment, notes smuggled in silk linings, and occasionally, a name whispered too loudly in a marble corridor. What the birds knew she knew. And what she knew, the right ears heard, quietly, discreetly, before court ever stirred. The Lady Falconer did not need to spy. She listened to the sky. Court whispers and feathered eyes. The palace courtyard had its own language. Boots on gravel meant a courier had come with bad news. Soft sandals on rushes suggested a concubine with something to hide. The heavy clack of a bishop's staff? That was rarely about prayer. But above it all, beneath the clouds and just beyond sight, the birds watched, and the birds remembered. Alina trained them not with whips or hunger, but with patience. Her gloves smelled of old leather and herbs. Her voice was like the rustle of a cloak, low, consistent, careful. The falcons responded to tone more than command, to rhythm more than order. She never raised her voice. They understood her silence. A hawk named Baron favored the queen's garden. He often returned with strands of thread dyed with rare Tyrian purple, or once, a brooch that had fallen from a certain lady's bodice in a rush. Alina returned the brooch by sending it through a laundry maid who owed her too many favors to count. A smaller bird, Kes, the kestrel, preferred the shadows of the council chamber's outer wall. There, from a hollow carved by years of nesting pigeons, she listened. Kes couldn't speak, of course. But Alina knew the bird's body language, a twitch for tension, a flutter for surprise, a frozen stance for danger. Messages didn't have to come in words. Sometimes they arrived as silence between others. The birds knew how to hear the unspoken. And Alina knew how to interpret it. That week, her birds had begun circling too often above the garden where the Duke of Tharn met the king's middle son. Too many visits. Too much laughter. Far too many smiles between men whose families shared only grudges. A message was forming. Alina just had to wait for it to land. The Falconer's Journal. Alina never kept a diary in words. Not like the court scribes, who scratched every hour of every day into dusty ledgers with too much ink and too little soul. Her records were quieter. One shelf of her small stone chamber held a row of wooden boxes, each filled with molted feathers sorted by bird and season. Another had small vials of sand from distant places, still clinging to the talons of her birds when they returned from unknown rooftops. Each grain meant something. The darker grains hinted at soot-covered tiles from the north wing kitchens. The golden ones suggested the Queen's terrace. But the true journal was in her sketches. Every night, Alina sat by her oil lamp, listening to the sounds of sleeping birds shifting softly on their perches. Her charcoal stick moved slowly across parchment, tracing the outline of a wing here, the bend of a claw there. But also, arrows pointing toward flight paths. Notes about strange behavior. A date, a time, a change in routine. Today, Baron dropped a ring into the washing basin. Signet of the Lord Chancellor. Unusual. Likely fell during altercation, no word of it yet in court. Alina didn't need gossip. She had behavior. She had feathers. She had time. The falcons, hawks, and kestrels brought her more than secrets. They brought her patterns. And patterns, once studied with enough silence, were more revealing than words. There was a serenity in it. A rhythm. While the rest of the court flailed through alliances and rivalries, duels and love letters, Alina watched from her perch of peace. Even her birds slept deeply, wings folded like old velvet against their sides. Outside, the wind turned softly. Night deepened. And somewhere in the halls below, a lie was about to be told. The birds would know by morning. The whisper in the aviary. The sun had not yet broken through the clouds when the whisper came. Not from a servant, nor a page, nor even from the wind, but from a kestrel named Veer, who refused to eat his breakfast. That alone would not have alarmed Alina. Birds had moods, just like courtiers. But Veer was known for his punctual hunger. Every morning at first light, he tapped his beak against the wooden post and waited. If she was late, he scolded her with short, sharp chirps. But this morning, he stood still, feathers puffed, eyes fixed not on her, but on the window. It wasn't a gesture of defiance. It was something else, alertness. Alina followed his gaze. The view from the aviary stretched across the orchard, just far enough to glimpse the Queen's private garden and the narrow path that led toward the bell tower. A gardener was down there, raking slowly in circles. Too slowly. The rake left no furrows in the soil. He wasn't raking at all, just moving in rhythm. Like a man who needed to look like he had a reason to be standing somewhere he shouldn't. Veer shifted again. A soft, clicking sound in his throat. Not a warning. A question. Alina stepped back quietly. The birds had noticed something. The garden had noticed something. And the rake had not turned a single stone. By afternoon, she would know more. Already, 2 sparrowhawks had returned with odd bits tied to their legs, one with a broken button from a livery coat, the other with a twist of fabric that smelled faintly of wine. Somewhere behind all of this, a rumor was forming. A quiet one for now. But Alina had learned to trust the birds. They felt a shift before the words ever did. A change in tone, in gesture, in the way the hands of a lord twitched when they lied. And tonight she would write nothing in her parchment ledger. She would simply place 1 gray feather at the base of Veer's perch. That would be enough. Messages without ink. By the next morning, the aviary had grown quieter. Not the hush of sleep, nor the calm of contentment, but a waiting stillness. The kind that descends before a storm, when even the birds decide that fluttering is not worth the trouble. Alina moved between the perches in silence, her hands trailing gently over the rough cords and polished wood. She did not need to speak here. She never really did. Instead, she pulled small tokens from the pouch at her hip. A knotted ribbon from the kitchen scullion who heard laughter through the keyhole. A bent pin from a lady's sleeve. A grape with a single bite taken out of it, left on her doorstep before dawn. They were not evidence, not in any court. But they carried something heavier than proof, the patterns of attention, the rhythms of the palace. The birds would know what to do with them. To Veer, she gave the ribbon. He blinked once, tilted his head, and took it delicately in his beak. A strange glimmer passed through his eyes, something between interest and insult. To Orla, the red-backed kite, she offered the bitten grape. Orla was always hungry. But today, she didn't eat it. She simply rolled it under one claw and stared. Then there was Bramble. A young merlin, barely 2 years trained, and far too clever for his own good. Alina gave him the bent pin. He took it, vanished from his perch like a trick of the eye, and darted out through the half-shuttered window. She knew better than to follow his flight. Bramble would be gone for hours, maybe days. He always returned with something that didn't belong to her. And somehow, it always told her exactly what she needed to know. By mid-morning, the air had shifted again. A hush in the corridors. A forgotten lute string twanging in an empty room. Someone, somewhere, had said something they shouldn't. And already, the birds had begun to listen. The tongues behind tapestries. There were always 2 palaces in any kingdom. The one built of stone and timber, with its flagged halls and iron chandeliers, its rushes scattered over floors and the smell of roast meats clinging to drapery. And the other, woven of whispers. Spun from glances, from hesitations in greeting, from too loud laughter over too thin wine. This second palace could not be mapped, and yet it was everywhere. In the pause before a servant knocked. In the breath a noblewoman held as a name was spoken. In the stillness that fell when a door opened on a conversation that had ended just a second too late. Alina walked between these 2 worlds with quiet steps. She knew which floorboards creaked outside the chamberlain's door. Which cook's boy had a jealous streak. Which lord wore perfume to mask the scent of someone else's perfume clinging to him. She didn't need parchment to record these things. She had talents. That morning, as she returned to the loft, a gray feather landed on her shoulder. It was Bramble's. He was back. He perched atop the lintel like a forgotten carving, his wings tucked, his eyes sharp. Dangling from his foot, a ring. Gold, delicate, inset with a ruby the size of a raindrop. It did not belong to any falconer. Alina took it without a word and held it to the light. There, inside the band, a name scratched with haste and poor tools, Isolde. The Queen's maidservant. Bramble rustled his feathers, ruffled with pride. He had done well. But Alina didn't smile. This ring would not have been lost lightly. Not in a garden. Not near the aviary. And certainly not clutched in the beak of a bird trained to hunt secrets. She slipped the ring into her pocket, murmured a soft sound only the birds would hear, and sat beneath the rafters, listening for footsteps that might be too careful. The palace was about to shift, and the birds were already watching. The secret beneath the feathers. Alina let the day pass slowly, as falconers do. She fed the hawks in measured silence, rubbed soft balm into old scratches on talons, replaced broken jesses with new ones she cut herself from behind. She whispered to the kestrels as they dozed on their perches. She sat with Bramble in the shade, his eyes half-lidded in the heat, and her own thoughts as restless as wind over wheat. She did not rush. To do so was to startle the truth back into the shadows. The ring from Isolde stayed nestled in her apron pocket, cool as a secret yet to be told. By afternoon, she slipped through the stable court and into the quiet garden at the edge of the Queen's wing. No one stopped her. Falconers were beneath the threshold of interest. That was her greatest power, always being nearly invisible. She walked slowly, past rows of lavender and yarrow, the same path Bramble had likely flown when he found the ring. No servants. No guards. But the scent of perfume hung thick on the breeze, sweet and honeyed, like crushed magnolia. Isolde's scent. She found the trail near the fountain. A heel print too small to be a nobleman's. A broken branch on the hedge, as if someone had turned back in fear. And then, faint in the grass, a glimmer. A hair comb. Pearl inlaid. Split along one side. Alina turned it over once in her palm. There was a smear of something on the teeth, berry red, not quite blood. And beneath it, an inscription in silver that time had nearly worn smooth, to my little bird. From C. She looked up. There was no one watching, but she felt it, that prickling at the back of the neck. As if the garden itself had gone still to listen. She pocketed the comb beside the ring. 2 pieces of someone else's story, carried now by hands that knew how to keep them quiet. Back in the loft, she let Bramble preen her hair like he used to when she was small. His feathers brushed her cheek with soft, precise affection. "You clever, wicked thing," she murmured. "What nest have you flown from this time?" And in the hush of falling dusk, the birds began to stir. Feathers in the library? It was well known among the castle's whisperers that the royal library housed more than scrolls. It stored secrets, the kind too delicate for parchment, and too dangerous for memory. Alina had not set foot there in years. She had once been allowed inside as a child, accompanying her father during winter storms when birds were grounded and boredom needed taming. Back then, she'd sat cross-legged on the floor beneath carved lions and painted saints, tracing her fingers along margins of illuminated bestiaries, memorizing the falcons drawn in gold and ochre. But tonight she slipped in through the back, the way the scribes did after hours. Through the door near the cloisters. Past the unlit corridor with its rows of leaded glass and cold stone arches. She brought no lantern. Bramble flew ahead, his pale wings barely visible in the dusk, landing silently on a rafter beam above the shelves. In her pocket, the ring and the comb pressed against her palm. Heavier now. As if the truths they held were waking. She knew what she was looking for. A ledger. Or perhaps a note. The Queen's falcon had once been cared for by Alina's father, old Tom, who had taught birds to bow before he taught his daughter to braid her own hair. He kept records. Everyone knew he kept records, though few knew where. Alina did. She knelt behind the lectern at the far wall, where the air smelled of wax and violets. There, hidden behind a row of moldy hunting manuals, she found the small cedar box. The ledger was still inside. His handwriting, spidery and neat, ran along the pages like threads of spider silk. Names. Dates. Illnesses. Training notes. And then, near the back, Lady Isolde's kestrel, trained to carry sealed messages. Found with minor wing strain. Recovered. No visible injuries. Bird was likely grounded by weather or late flight. Recovered a token with it, golden ring. Engraved. Not Queen's. Delivered token to the Queen's, maid personally. Maid seemed distressed. No further entry. She stared at the words for a long while. Outside, a bell told the hour. Quiet. Deliberate. Bramble shifted on his beam. The air seemed to tighten. Alina tucked the book back, not quite breathing. Some messages, it seemed, returned even when their senders did not. The Queen's mirror. There were only 2 people in the castle who owned a mirror polished enough to see the whole face clearly. The King and the Queen. One was locked behind oak doors and guards with too many swords. The other? Hung quietly beside a window overlooking the east garden, where rose hips now withered in the wind. Alina didn't go there often. The Queen's chambers were a world wrapped in velvet and stillness, where even the dust seemed careful not to settle. No one barged in. Not even the Lord Steward. To enter uncalled was to risk exile, social or otherwise. But tonight, the Queen had sent for her. Alina stood just inside the doorway, gloved hands folded, Bramble perched obediently at her shoulder. He blinked once, then twice, watchful, still, more polite than usual. Queen Aelina sat at her table, combing her hair with a slow rhythm that might have belonged to a woman with nothing left to fear. Behind her, the mirror caught the scene in full, the falconer in her wind-worn cloak, the pale bird, the brushstrokes of gold thread in the Queen's gown. Reflections of 3 lives rarely seen together. "You found something," the Queen said quietly, without turning. Alina bowed her head. "Only traces, Your Grace." The Queen nodded, as though she'd expected as much. "They never come back whole," she murmured. "The ones who carry what others dare not speak." She set the comb down beside a single parchment, unsealed, unsigned. It was folded precisely, but not elegantly, a note written in haste. "I trained my kestrel to bring back truths," she said. "But he brought back this." She gestured. Alina stepped closer. The letter was not long, but it was enough. It spoke of a liaison, forbidden but not unfamiliar. It spoke of betrayal, but not between the Queen and her lover. It was from a lady-in-waiting, a dear friend, who had vanished before spring. "My bird brought it back," the Queen whispered. "And with it, a ring that does not belong to me." Alina didn't speak. Outside, a breeze caught the curtains. Bramble stirred, but did not fly. The Queen stood slowly and looked into the mirror, not at herself, but at Alina. "Can you train a bird to forget?" she asked softly. Alina shook her head. "No, my lady." The Queen's smile was sad. "Then perhaps we must learn from them." The Feathered Whisper Network. The forest at the edge of the castle grounds was called Harrow's Breath, but no one remembered why. It wasn't haunted in the dramatic sense, no wailing ghosts, no sudden storms, no eerie lights. But people lowered their voices when speaking of it, the way they did with old wounds or past lovers. Alina went there often. Not to hide, but to listen. The birds who roost in Harrow's breath were not noble hawks or sharp-eyed falcons. They were smaller, rust-colored finches and mud-cake thrushes, jackdaws with broken tail feathers, magpies who carried bone chips in their nests. They were not trained. Not hers. But they were watchers all the same. When she stood among them, hood down, gloves off, they sometimes spoke. Not in words, of course. But in absence, in flutters, in patterns. A silence too long in one part of the trees. A sudden departure from a certain bough. A feather found too far from its kin. These were signals, subtle as wind shifting between the reeds. It was here, in the hush of Harrow's breath, that Alina pieced together the real map of the castle's secrets. Not drawn in ink, but in the movements of wings. Each morning she would return to her cottage, carefully lay out her notes, and mark them with dried rose hips and smooth river stones, each representing a bird, a clue, a risk. Not every trail led somewhere. Not every whisper was true. But there was a rhythm to it, and in rhythm she trusted. A magpie had shown her the path to the hidden garden wall, where letters were exchanged between a kitchen maid and a merchant's son. A robin had vanished for 3 days, only to return with blood on its claws and a scrap of royal blue silk. She had found the rest of the gown, mud-stained, torn, by the brook beneath the beeches. And always, always, there was Bramble. He did not return to his perch each night like the others. Sometimes he stayed away for days, and Alina did not call him back. He was her sentinel, her scout, and perhaps the only creature she trusted entirely. When he came back, silently as ever, he would rest one foot on her windowsill, wings tucked, eyes like ink against moonlight. And she would say, "What have you brought me this time, little ghost?" He never answered. But sometimes he dreamed aloud. Bramble's return. He came back just before dawn. No dramatic entrance, no scrape of talons on wood, no proud caw announcing his arrival. Just the softest thud of clawed feet against the sill, the hush of wings folding into stillness. Bramble's head tilted once, sharply, as if measuring the weight of her breath in the quiet. Alina didn't startle. She was already awake, seated in the same stool where she'd fallen asleep, ink dried on her fingertips and one boot still half-laced. The candle had burned low, little more than a molten nub, but the window held enough twilight to make out his shape. That outline was unmistakable. Lean, long, always a little ragged, as if no one had ever quite finished making him. "Long night?" she whispered. Bramble didn't blink. He rarely did. Instead, he dropped what he carried. A scrap of ribbon, purple, frayed at one end, looped in a peculiar knot. Royal purple. Not the plum of merchants, not the lilac of matrons. This was the kind dyed from crushed sea snails, the color that clung to sovereigns and secrets, like a second skin. Alina stared at it, then reached out slowly, lifting it from the wood with 2 fingers. Bramble hopped down to the table, then up to her shoulder, where he settled in the groove near her collarbone. His feathers brushed her neck as he shifted. "I'm listening," she murmured. She meant it too. For Bramble did not speak in words, but in heat, in scent, in the glint of things. He carried stories in fibers, in pollen stuck to claws, in the bits of straw stuck between feathers. A good falconer knew how to track movement. A great one? Knew how to read stillness. And what Bramble brought was not just a ribbon. It was a warning. That knot, Alina realized, was not carelessness, it was a signal. The kind used in old courtships and old betrayals. The knot that meant, keep watching. Not all is done. She stood slowly, her muscles stiff with sleep and suspicion. Outside, the sky had begun its slow bleed from gray to gold, and a single bell in the distance told the hour before sunrise. It was going to be a long day. But Bramble had returned. And with him came the next chapter. The ribbon's message. Alina didn't ask who the ribbon belonged to. Not yet. First came the ritual, old as any chant, older than the king who ruled these halls. She laid the ribbon on her worktable, smoothed it flat, and began the quiet craft of listening. Not to sound. To things. The ribbon smelled faintly of lavender. Expensive. Imported even. But beneath it, yes, there it was, an oily tang of rosewood polish. The kind used on ceremonial doors, the kind brushed lovingly over the armrests of chairs that hadn't been sat in for centuries, but were suddenly being used again. She leaned in closer. A single strand of thread was woven through the knot, near invisible but clumsily tied. It had a sheen to it, silver and gray, like hair. Or like moon thread, pulled from the fingers of the Queen's secret tailor. Alina smiled grimly. This wasn't gossip. This was a summons. Someone had found a way to send a message without paper. Without ink. Without writing that could be read aloud in the wrong room. The knot held meaning, yes, but so did its carrier. Bramble was not just a bird. He was a whisper with wings. She unknotted the ribbon carefully. The inside was stained with something reddish. Not blood. Not wine. Pomegranate juice. Old Queen Sibylla's favorite. She hadn't been seen in over 3 months. Said to be unwell. Said to be resting. But Bramble's journey had not taken him to a sick room. No, his claws were clean. No straw from infirmaries. Only one thin scale stuck to his talon, the kind found in frescoed tiles. The Queen was not unwell. She was plotting. Alina turned, slowly, and Bramble shifted again on her shoulder. The air in the room had changed. Sharpened. She was not just a falconer now. Not just a keeper of wings and watchers. She was being called. And though her place was always just outside the palace, just behind the curtains of court and ceremony, she would step inside again. A court of quiet knives. The next morning, Alina left before the sun crested the orchard wall. Bramble rode her shoulder, hooded now, his head bowed in patience. A traveling cloak draped her frame, its hem damp with dew, its lining stitched with pockets no tailor had seen. The kind of cloak you wore when you didn't want to be remembered. When you moved like fog between hedges and left behind only the faintest scent of moss. The path to the royal residence curled through the southern gardens, where lords no longer walked and the herb beds had grown wild with thyme and trefoil. The place had become unfashionable after a countess had fainted there years ago. They said the lavender was too strong. But Alina knew it was because the lavender hid things. Little conversations. Small betrayals. She passed no guards. She didn't need to. The kitchen boys, already hauling baskets of bread through narrow doors, tipped their heads in recognition but asked nothing. An old porter opened the side gate as if she were expected. And maybe she was. In palaces like this, the servants knew more than the crown. The Queen's wing was silent. Not empty. Just silent. Like a pond that had gone still before the plunge. Alina stood before the door of a room gilded long ago and knocked once with her gloved knuckle. It opened before her hand dropped. And there, not on a throne but seated plainly near a fire, sat Sibylla. She looked older, but not in the way people feared. Her face was unpainted, but not undone. Her hair had silvered at the temples, yes, but she wore it without shame. Her hands, folded over her lap, held a paper fan, closed. "A bird," she said softly, "can be more dangerous than any dagger." Alina stepped forward. I'm ready, she replied. Sibylla smiled. You always were. And the door closed behind them. A room without witness. The chamber was warm but dim, lit only by the flicker of coals in a hearth carved with ivy and foxes. Its windows were shuttered. Its corners watched. And on a little table sat a silver cage, not meant to hold, but to wait. Sibylla poured them each a cup of something pale, steeped herbs and honey, and placed no crown between them. Not literally. Not figuratively. For this moment, they were two women in the hush of a heavy morning. Alina set Bramble on the perch. The hawk did not stir. He still listens? Sibylla asked. Always, Alina murmured. Even in sleep. Especially then. A silence followed that wasn't empty but full. The kind of silence made by unsent letters, unread missives, and messages carried not on wings but between glances. Sibylla took a breath. They think I've forgotten how to rule. That because I do not bark, I do not bite. You were never the barking kind. No, she said, with the ghost of a smile. But now they plot with louder mouths. In gardens. In baths. On balconies they believe are theirs alone. Alina took a sip from her cup and nodded. And so, you called me. Sibylla met her eyes. Because you understand quiet. You understand flight. Alina reached beneath her cloak and withdrew a small leather pouch, soft with age, sealed with wax. Inside were feathers. Not to fly, but to recognize. Dyed tips. Cut barbs. Symbols known only to those trained to see the invisible ink of birds. One for the Duke. One for the Bishop. One for the knight with the smile like a coin. And the fourth? Sibylla asked. Alina looked at the fire. For the one you once loved. The Queen said nothing for a long moment. Her fingers tightened around the cup. Then, even him. Outside, the first bell of the day began its rise into the cold air. But inside, a plan had already taken wing. The flight no one saw. The falcons did not launch from towers. They left from chimneys cloaked in smoke. From cellar slats and orchard walls, where ivy concealed their perch and pine pitch lined their talons to mute the scrape of stone. No trumpet. No stirruped rider galloping across the plains. Just feathers on wind and secrets wrapped in instinct. Alina moved like memory, soft-soled boots gliding over frost-touched earth, her hood drawn low. In one gloved hand, a rolled scrap of vellum no wider than a finger. In the other, a little whistle carved from pearwood. She blew it once. Barely audible. But the dusk knew it well. A falcon pealed from the gables above. She tied the message to its leg, not the words themselves, but a ciphered thread. Color for location. Not for urgency. Twist for threat. It meant nothing to the untrained. Everything to those who watched birds more closely than men. One by one they vanished into fog. Not toward battlefields, but toward balconies. To bathhouses where steamy air made voices careless. To rose gardens behind abbey walls. To wine cellars where plots fermented longer than the vintages. Each falcon would linger. They didn't need to speak. Just to be seen. Just to remind those who whispered treason that the Queen had ears of her own. And they flew back, each bearing the smallest token, tassel, coin, seal scraped from wax. Evidence enough to shift the weight of power without ever drawing a sword. That night, Alina stood once more atop the rookery tower. Bramble returned last. Silent, dignified. His eyes unreadable. He landed not on the perch, but on her shoulder. Together they watched the castle windows darken, one by one. Except for one. The Queen's chamber. Still lit. Still waiting. Alina bowed her head, not as a servant, nor subject, but as a shadow who'd done her part. Then she whispered, "Let them think birds know nothing," and turned into the hush, disappearing like smoke into the trees. The stillness after the wings. There is a kind of quiet that only comes after flight. Not silence, exactly, but a hush that settles deep into the bones. Like the forest holding its breath after snowfall, or the way a page rests in a book long closed. Alina was never seen at court again. Not in the way courtiers wished. No velvet train. No jeweled hood. No answering bow to their curious glances. She had always been a whisper rather than a word. But sometimes, late in the evenings, when the air above the palace turned soft and purple and the last bells had long since rung, a falcon would glide past the tallest window. Unhurried. Not hunting. Just watching. And in villages 3 valleys east, old women spinning flax would pause to glance at the eaves. In taverns where gossip ran thicker than ale, a single feather on the threshold might still a dozen tongues. No one knew how far her birds flew. Only that they arrived when truth needed remembering, and vanished before it became too sharp. Legends grew, as they always do. They said her falcons could read dreams. That she wore a gown stitched with messages from traders who thought no one had seen. That she had fallen in love with a prince once, and trained his bird to tell her when he lied. But she remained only that, a story told at dusk, when fires were low and sleep came slow. A tale mothers shared with daughters too clever for their own good. And in the hush of those moments, just before dreams, just after breath, came the sense of wings above. Wide. Silent. Watching. Not cruelly. Not cruelly at all. Just with the calm attention of someone who had once trained messengers to carry secrets not for war, but for peace. And perhaps, even now, a bird waits on your rooftop. But it will not speak unless you are ready. So breathe deep. Let the wings pass. The night is long, and your heart is safe. Sleep now. Sleep.